First, I will give you just a quick words about tools. The first one that I think you should consider is getting the proper pen, because you'll need a pencil that is soft enough to not destroy the paper. I recommend the 4B pencil. Some like the 5B. 6B is even smoother, but it can also mess, so you'll probably end up with your hands being all black. Don't use ink and stuff like that, because that will ruin the paper. So pick a soft pencil to trace the pattern. That's my recommendation number one. And secondly, paper. Now you need to have a fairly transparent tissue paper that will show through the lines. Usually I find that the sort of Swedish tracing paper can work as well, but the key is that it has to be transparent. And I will give you a very special tip now, because I actually don't use these pricey tissue paper that you can buy on a roll for most of my Burdastyle tracing. Instead, I use this. This is grease-proof paper, you know, the sort of paper that you use for baked goods and stuff to keep them separated and not the grease from shining through, and, you know, covering sandwiches and stuff like that. There are two reasons why I prefer this. One is it's much cheaper, and secondly, it has the perfect width for not everything, but most things, because the problem with the Burdastyle sheets is that the patterns are laid on top of each other. So if you put a big sheet of paper covering all that pattern sheet, you will have to move that sheet around, because you can't trace all the pattern pieces in one setting. So this is why I prefer this more narrow paper, because it's much more easy to move around. And I use this width for blouses, pockets, more narrow skirts, sleeves, did I say that maybe? Also for the front of the pants, this is usually enough width. It won't work for the back pant leg, or it won't work for wide skirts and stuff like that. Then I use the wider sheets, but for most part this is my number one thing. Cheap roll of grease-proof paper. So if this is similar in your country like the ones we have in Sweden, I do recommend that you check that out as an option. And even so, you might consider getting a pattern tissue that isn't super wide, because this is much more easy to move around. And the third tool that I recommend is some kind of seam allowance gum. Now, we in Sweden like to use this funny name, it's called Pfiffikus. I think it's German. Initially, and it has several different widths for different kind of seam allowance, and I use this, I line that with the sewing lines on the pattern, and then I trace it. So if you have one of these, I highly recommend using that one, or you can use, I know there are so many clever options today on how to add seam allowance, so this perhaps feels a bit old school, but this is the thing that I learned using, and I've stuck with that one. So these were 3 tools that I recommend that you use for tracing the papers. And now I will give you a step-by-step guide on how to trace the Burdastyle pattern. Today we're making the elastic top in issue number 1, 2017. So we will find that one. It has pattern number 105. And what we need to do before we start tracing is to figure out a few things. And most of that information is in this box. Here we can see that the pattern will be drafted with blue lines and can be found on pattern sheet D. We can also see what numbers the pattern pieces have, and also another important thing, what sort of lines my particular size will have. This you have to figure out here, because on the pattern sheet Burdastyle usually don't tell which size each line corresponds to. But before we begin drafting, we need to figure out one more thing, and that is, are there any pattern pieces that we need to draft ourselves? Because Burdastyle usually don't add pattern pieces for simple rectangular shapes. So there will be instruction for that too, for the measurements for each size. Alright, now we need to locate all those pattern pieces, and Burda has a trick for that too. If you can see, there are numbers along the lines, and those numbers
actually shows the placing of the particular pattern piece. So in this case we are looking for a blue, so we can locate that and then just look straight down following a straight line until we find that particular pattern piece. To begin tracing, I just attach the tracing paper on top using pins. I smooth out the surface to make sure that it will be even when I start tracing. To trace the pattern pieces, I use a pencil, in this case 4B, and I gently press it towards the lines and then slowly start tracing along those lines. And if I do find it hard to draft even lines, I can also use a curved ruler or a straight ruler depending on the lines. Once you're done tracing, there is one final step, and that is to jot down informations regarding what size you have traced, what the pattern number is, the pattern piece number, and if there are any notes that is good to know. That will make it easier when you're cutting the pattern pieces and also if you want to make the garment again. And now for the fun part, adding seam allowance. Oh well, I know some of you don't like it, and I would lie if I said it was my best thing, but there are actually at least one big advantage with adding your own seam allowance, and that is that you can pick the best seam allowance for each type of seam. So for a side seam you will probably add more seam allowance, and for curved seams such as the neckline you'll probably add a smaller seam allowance. If you want to get more suggestions on which seam allowance is best for each kind of seam, I recommend that you check out my blog post that I've written about this subject, and those links will be in the description section. Here is my first hack for adding seam allowance. I don't draft full lines. Instead, I just use little dots. So I place the ruler and measure out the seam allowance, add a dot, move the ruler, add a dot, move the ruler, add a dot, and just continue doing that until I have covered the entire pattern piece. And my second hack for adding seam allowance to Burdastyle pattern is that it's good to know that each side seam on the tops is 1 centimeters. So if you can live with adding 1 or perhaps 2 centimeters and have bigger sizes on your pattern sheet, you can just trace along those lines instead for the side seam. This will work for tops and some skirts, and only for these side seams. We also need to make sure that we have marked all the notches on the pattern piece, that they are not always easy to find, so consult again the instructions, and there you will find on the diagram what sort of notches that will be on each pattern piece.